thank you for the introduction. So let me start out just with a little background to the analysis, because in 2008, I think the economic crisis caused a general legitimacy crisis for neoliberal globalization. That's been hegemonic for 40 years, really, since about 1980. And all the traditional parties are losing support everywhere. We see it throughout Europe, and certainly here within the Democratic and Republican parties also. So I think that has set off a debate within the ruling class, transnational ruling class, about how to regain legitimacy, how to regain stability, and what's going to be the next historic round of accumulation. So I think those really are the major questions that are sort of being looked at by the ruling class. And what I want to do is use a Gramscian analysis of hegemony, hegemonic blocks, to look at this question. Because
That's okay. The mic was off.
The whole power was off.
Oh,
Someone tricked over
Go right ahead. It's okay.
oh, I shouldn't go over my intro again.
No.
So using a Gramscian analysis of hegemonic blocks,
If you turn it down, it's...
I could push this back a bit.
Yeah, that's true too.
Either way. Because it's distorting
Yeah.
whatever for you. Go ahead.
So in looking at hegemonic blocks, we're looking at a dominant ideology, dominant political and economic coalition of ruling class fractions, as well as having a social base, and using both consensus and coercion to rule. Consensus not only in terms of the working class and middle class, but consensus within the ruling class itself. And these blocks typically can last 30 to 40 years, such as the Keynesian bloc that came out of the Roosevelt coalition, the New Deal, and the neoliberal bloc that's dominated both the Republican and Democratic Party and dominated the European parties at least since 1980. So that's going on almost 40 years now too. So as I was saying, the 08 crisis put them into a legitimacy crisis. It was sort of all the contradictions were now laid bare for everybody to see, the growing inequality, the austerity, the poverty, etc. And so I think today there's three projects in competition with each other to trying to form a new ruling class consensus. The first one, I would say, is the traditional global neoliberalism. They're trying to sort of reconsolidate themselves with small neo-Keynesian adjustments. And this they call inclusive capitalism. The second one is authoritarian capitalism, Neo-Fascism, based in the security state and along the lines of militarized and repressive accumulation. And the third project I would say is green capitalism. So I'm going to spend most of my time on the authoritarian and the green capitalism, but just a few words about the inclusive capitalism bloc, because really I think that's still the most broadly accepted among the transnational capitalist class. And it has a lot of people out there pushing it, like Larry Summers and many others. But I think it just doesn't have much to offer beyond greater and continued stagnation. A few little neo-Keynesian adjustments, I think, aren't really going to do it. It's sort of like a zombie ideology. It keeps on living on because it's been around for so long. One of my favorite quotes on inclusive capitalism is a guy, Nigel Wilson, who is a UK financial executive overseeing about $1.5 trillion. He says, and this is without any irony, The good news is that inclusive capitalism needn't involve great sacrifice. You can be a capitalist and still feel good about it. So that's sort of where they're coming from. And they're talking about a capitalism that should include everyone, although that's sort of an oxymoron when we talk about capitalism, right? But I think the two new projects that are really starting to compete for power are the authoritarian capitalism and the green capitalist projects, because they're not really hegemonic blocks at this point. So I want to cover the authoritarian capitalism first, and here I think William Robinson has theorized it, perhaps in the most complete manner, though of course obviously a lot of people are writing about police state, neo-fascism, authoritarian capitalism. But Robinson's basically, it says that the basic problem is too much money with nowhere to go. In other words, stagnation. And we know there's about $8 trillion that's just being sat on, not invested, or it's invested in bonds that are actually at zero or even negative returns. And that comes from the problem, of course, of 40 years of growing austerity and income gap and people not having the income to consume more, so why invest more if there's no market for the new commodities? That's stagnation, it's overproduction. It's classic, right? So let me quote here from Bill's writing on this just a little bit. As he says, there is a convergence around global capitalism's political need for social control and repression, and its economic need to perpetuate accumulation. Global police state and the rise of the digital economy appear to fuse three fractions. I think this is key to his concept, the idea of three fractions of capitalism coming together to try to form a new hegemonic bloc. And those fractions are capital are coming around a combined process of financial speculation, militarized accumulation, into which the transnational capitalist class is unloading billions of dollars in surplus accumulated capital. Financial capital supplies the credit for investments in the tech sector and in the technologies of the global police state. Consequently, as private accumulation fuses with state militarization, the fate of Silicon Valley, Wall Street, all become tied to the warfare and repressive state. So I want to sort of unpack that a little bit. And the US, of course, I think being the primary example under Trump, and the most important because of the position as the most powerful and richest country in the world. But obviously throughout Europe, the rise of authoritarian parties are present in Brazil, in Turkey, in the Philippines, in India, in Russia, in Israel. So this is obviously a transnational trend, and obviously very dangerous. But I think it's a trend rife with internal contradictions and problems. So let's look at these three factions that Bill talks about. And I think he talks about them correctly, but as I say, it's questionable to me if it will develop into an actual hegemonic bloc. It's a power bloc, but I don't think it's hegemonic within the ruling class. First, the question of finance capital merging with the military. Yes, there's billions of dollars invested in the military, about 120 billion invested in the three major US military corporations, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Northrop Grumman. But this is business, it's not ideology for finance capitalism. And of course, an authoritarian neo-fascist state is also an ideological state. If we look at Lockheed Martin, which has more money invested than either Boeing or Grumman or Raytheon, there's about $49 billion invested in Lockheed Martin. That's a substantial amount of money, but on the other hand, there's also $49 billion invested in Philip Morris, the tobacco company. So the same financial giants that are in the military are in fact in everything. If you look at the major 20, 30, 50 financial institutions in the world, they're invested in all major sectors of the capitalist economy. And in fact, the same giants that are invested in the military are invested in China. They're invested in all the major state banks in China. They're invested in all the major state-owned corporations in China. And so if we're thinking about this fusion of finance capital and the military as a cohesive sector of a bloc, it seems a bit contradictory, because one of the greatest military threats in the world today, obviously arising from the Trump administration, is the trade war with China and militarization of Asia and a possible conflict between China and the US at some point. But that doesn't really make sense from the point of finance capital, who has billions of dollars invested in China, as well as billions of dollars invested in the military. As I say, it's business, it's not ideology. Secondly, if we look at ideology itself, the transnational capitalist class is in terms of ideology, is cosmopolitan and multicultural, which is necessary for a global market and global production. They're very happy to use the brightest and best that capitalism can provide, no matter the religion, no matter the race, no matter the country. So whether it's the mayor of London, Mr. Khan, or Barack Obama as president of the United States, that fits perfectly well into cosmopolitan and multiracial globalization. It doesn't fit very well into reactionary nationalism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant hatred, which is sort of the red meat of the neo-fascist authoritarian capitalism. So there's an ideological disconnect here too. And in fact, we've seen this being played out in the Republican Party for the last several decades. Obviously, Romney and McCain represented the traditional globalist Wall Street faction. And the Tea Party and the base have been moving more and more towards the nationalist bent until Trump was able to grasp that and become president. So that's been an unstable contradiction for a while. The other problem I see is, in terms of an authoritarian police state, you obviously have to have a politically consolidation between the political leadership and the security state, the CIA, the FBI, the military. And what is Trump's relationship with the security state? It's essentially horrible. It's never been this bad with any president that we've seen. Certainly he has some support within that apparatus, but he has attacked, belittled, made fun of almost every major figure in the FBI and the CIA, and has taken all sorts of decisions that the military and the whole foreign policy establishment, it drives them crazy. Opening up negotiations with North Korea, breaking the Iran nuclear deal, saying he's going to pull out troops from Syria, saying he's going to pull out troops from Afghanistan. All this stuff is far and away outside of the consensus in the security state foreign policy circles. And I'd like to quote here just one interesting quote. This is from the head of the Navy SEALs, William McRaven. And those of you who know McRaven, he's like a hero within the military. He's the guy who led and organized the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, and he's the guy who organized the special forces on a global basis that has been leading the so-called war on terror. And he wrote a column in the Washington Post, of all papers, that says, quote, Trump has embarrassed us in the eyes of our children, humiliated us on the world stage, and worst of all, divided us as a nation. He went on to call Trump's description of the news media as enemy of the people as the greatest threat to American democracy he has ever seen. So if you're going to have a neo-fascist or authoritarian state, obviously the spear point of that has got to be guys like McRaven. The thing about the US military is that there's a long tradition of constitutionality within it. Their main job and role has always been to protect capitalism, not to side with the Republican or Democratic Party. Now, we know the officer corps and most of the leadership in the FBI and CIA are Republicans, but nevertheless, there's also this inherited ideological neutrality when it comes to pushing towards fascism and the breaking of bourgeois democracy. So there would have to generally be a purge of a lot of military leaders to really accomplish a police authoritarian state. Not impossible, but I don't think all that probable. Lastly, what about tech workers? Because the fourth industrial revolution, AI, all the technology is essential to the new military weaponry that we see, absolutely. And there's a long history, obviously, of Silicon Valley and the tech sector being involved with the military. But it's interesting that Google, Microsoft, Salesforce, and also among Stanford graduate tech students, there has been a general opposition of getting all these companies involved with the military-industrial complex. There's been letters, there's been petitions, there's been protests. So I'd like to read just very briefly from a petition of Google workers that says, we ask that Project Maven, about a $10 billion military project, be canceled, and that Google draft, publicize, and enforce a clear policy stating that neither Google nor its contractors will ever build warfare technology. And as a result of that, Google pulled out of Maven, as well as the Joint Enterprise Defense Infrastructure, which is a huge merging of AI with data abilities of the Pentagon. So that doesn't rule out that corporate executives will, of course, continue to seek contracts with the Pentagon, but it does add a very interesting element of resistance among tech workers to authoritarian neo-fascist state. And of course, the tech sector is sort of famous for having libertarian ideology. So in conclusion on this part, I would say that we already have a power block here of authoritarian capitalism. And it's international or transnational. But it hasn't consolidated into a hegemonic bloc in the way that neoliberalism and globalization did. That included both the Republican and Democratic Party, all the social democratic parties, and all the conservative parties in Europe, as well as most of the Chinese leadership, as a matter of fact, too. It just hasn't achieved that level of consensus. And if it does, it will be unstable. I think in terms of the transnational class, the danger is what I would call passive acquiescence to a neo-fascist state rather than outright support. In other words, as long as you're giving us tax breaks, as long as we're making money, you know, we're not going to oppose you that hard. But as for active participation, I think that may be another question. So authoritarian capitalism seeks stability through repression, and it seeks to expand accumulation through an expansive military and a repressive apparatus and anti-immigration concentration camps. That's the strategy being offered. And I would say, of course, that's the most dangerous thing that we face as an American people and as a left. So let's look at green capitalism for a bit. I think this is a very broad emerging bloc, and it goes all the way from neoliberal greens like Michael Bloomberg and Robert Rubin and Hank Paulson, guys who Wall Street billionaires and come out of Goldman Sachs and Citicorp, all the way to Green New Deal radicals. And here, they're also presenting a vision of a new accumulation, a historic round of new accumulation in energy, in transportation, in architecture, in cleaning up toxic pollution and plastics. It's really a very broad vision of renewed accumulation. And importantly, creating millions of new jobs and regaining legitimacy through this process. Not legitimacy through repression, but legitimacy through consensus, right? And importantly, incorporating a lot of the green opposition today into the state and into the bloc itself, what Gramsci called a passive revolution. And here we're also thinking of a bloc in terms of the 30 to 40 year transformation. That's already clear in their thinking, because if you look at all the energy transformation plans that are out there in state after state and throughout Europe, everybody's already talking about 2050 as the point for 100% renewable energy systems. That's already, 30 or so years out in terms of their thinking. Now, major neoliberal green capitalist think tanks have been around since the 1990s. And in fact, even in the 1980s, the Club of Rome was really the first one, and there's still actually the most Keynesian one out there. But all these major sort of corporate-funded think tanks mainly promote the market as the solution. Cap and trade, little government regulations, voluntary corporate leadership, and of course a revolution in technology. Green New Deals have also been out there before the current AOC and Senator Markley Green New Deal. There's been Green New Deals put out by the United Nations, by the Green European Foundation, by the Center for American Progress, and I run down a lot of that in my book, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Democracy. And those plans look much more at more government involvement, more regulation. They emphasize jobs more, too. But the really significant breakthrough of the current Green New Deal is put out there by Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markley, is the close linking of social justice with ecological justice. And I think that's really the key to the Green New Deal, because that is the best way to defeat authoritarian capitalism. The spear point of the neo-fascist state is xenophobia and racism. So if you put forward a Green New Deal without taking on the question of social justice, you can't really defeat the authoritarian hegemonic bloc or power bloc, because you're not taking on their main appeal to their social base. That has to be confronted directly. And of course, the neoliberal green capitalists want to separate the environmental crisis from the crisis of humanity. They want to save the planet essentially by using cheap labor to produce solar panels and wind turbines. And this is that separation, that false duality, that humanity is not part of nature, is of course deeply embedded in capitalist rationality, and it's been part of their worldview really since the Industrial Revolution. But of course, we as humans are as much part of nature as every other part of the earth, every animal, every plant. We're all tied in a singular ecological network of evolution. And so the bringing together of social justice and environmental justice, I think, is key, and is certainly the path that the left has to pursue. The other really important element here, too, is China, for us to consider. Because China is the acknowledged leader in sustainable technologies. And they took that leadership in just about a 5-year period. I mean, they went from almost nothing to leading in solar and wind power. leading in hydro, electric vehicles, competing in lithium batteries and storage. And all these are key to China's vision of where they're going to and their accumulation and their leadership, their 2025 industrial plan. They spent $132 billion in 2017. They were far and away the largest investor in renewable energy in the world. In fact, they had 1/3 of the world's total investment in renewable energies. They hold 3.5 million of the 8 million jobs in sustainable energy worldwide. And this puts China at the center of green accumulation. 5 of the top 10 wind turbine manufacturers are Chinese. 4 of the top 6 solar producers are Chinese. And these are already transnational corporations, thoroughly integrated into transnational production, transnational markets, transnational investors, etc. So it's just, to think of it just as Chinese is really sort of falling back into this trap of nation-centric ideas of the world. You have Western capital invested in all these areas, in China itself, and Chinese capital invested going the other way. And of course, President Xi has talked about the building an ecological civilization, and the top leadership of the Communist Party, of course, accepts and is knowledgeable about environmental science, something that we can't say is true about the Republican Party, which is the most powerful political party in the most powerful country in the world. So having that party reject basic fundamental science is a huge roadblock to achieving the necessary changes here. Now, let's look a little bit at green investing, which is becoming quite substantial, and again is transnational. So there's about 2,000 funds dedicated to green investing with $5 trillion under asset management. In 2018, the total for green funds in bonds, in assets, in private financial capital was now at 12 trillion. That's a substantial amount of money.
What was that first number you used, 5 trillion?
5 trillion in asset management, but then you have bonds and venture capital and other things, right? China has the largest market for green bonds in the world. It's about $100 billion. There's the New Development Bank, which most of us are familiar with as the BRIC Bank. Remember, Brazil, Russia, India, China, the BRICS. They formed a bank a number of years ago, and 78% of their financial activity goes towards renewable energy projects. There's also the very important establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was started by China, boycotted by the US, has been joined by 84 countries throughout the world. I think Japan and US are pretty much the only countries outside of it. And they exclude any loans or investment in nuclear power or coal, and have made commitments to green, sustainable loans and projects in energy. Now, what are some of the contradictions and roadblocks here in terms of green capitalism? Well, they exist just as there are a lot of internal contradictions of authoritarian capitalism too in the project. So when we look at the One Belt, One Road, this incredibly huge vision of infrastructure development that the Chinese have put forth, it's beyond any other planning or vision by any other sector of the transnational capitalist class. I mean, it's calling for about $6 trillion in infrastructure, linking about 84 countries. It's just huge. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a big part of it. That's why 84 countries joined that bank. But if we look at the 165 energy and transportation projects worth 143 billion, that is the One Belt, One Road has gotten involved in, we see that 72% are for fossil fuel energy and only 5.3% for solar and wind. China still burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. It has a commitment for 700 new coal plants. And between 2001 and 2017, China participated in 240 coal projects in 25 different countries. Their involvement in coal growing 300% since the inception of One Belt, One Road. So obviously that undercuts the whole ability to create an ecological civilization. And I think when we view that, to me it seems that China is involved in a struggle just as the US ruling class is involved in a struggle. That there's obvious struggle between green, sustainable energy projects in the US and the fossil fuel energy industry and the coal industry. That's a battle inside the US. And inside of China, the fossil fuel ministries and the coal industry still maintains tremendous political clout and is in competition with the green projects that are being rolled out in China too. And the Chinese leadership is trying to fight that out and balance it out and figure out their way forward. It's not that President Xi lays out the line and every people have this over-centralized idea of the Chinese Communist Party that it's, you know, one directive and everybody in the country follows it. It's nowhere near like that. Ministries are powerful, regions are powerful. There's a lot of competition, both politically and economically within China. And so this is another aspect of the Green New Deal versus authoritarian fossil fuel capitalism. Another, I think, danger here is that we actually do have a green capitalist hegemonic bloc come to power. And if that happens, in one way, of course, it's much more preferable than continuing with neoliberal globalization, or certainly, God forbid, a authoritarian capitalism coming to full bloom. But with that type of reformist bloc for 30 or 40 years, we could see enough technological advances and enough social policy initiatives that avoid explosive social and ecological crisis to the point where society accepts a new reality of droughts, greater fires, greater storms, masses of environmental refugees, because capitalism, green capitalism, will not be able to solve fundamentally and in a full-blown manner the ecological crisis. They're really incapable of doing that because of the internal logic. I'll give you one example of that, and then I'll get on to my conclusion. The solar industry has already faced two major recessions. And it's sort of a fascinating process, because what happened was when China entered solar power production, prices dropped dramatically and production went up dramatically. And what this caused was an economic crisis. When solar panel costs came down, profits also therefore dropped for a lot of corporations. And as China started to produce more and more solar panels, there was overproduction, about twice as many solar panels as could be consumed by the market at the time. And this actually happened twice. So only under capitalism can a technology that is needed to save the world, really, I mean, it's one of the fundamental things that we need to move forward as a human civilization. And the exact thing that you want is a lower price and greater production, right? That's exactly what we want. But under capitalism, what's the end result of that? Is an economic recession within that industry and the failure and bankruptcy of dozens of solar panel corporations. This gives you an idea why capitalism cannot fully confront and solve the ecological crisis. There's obviously other reasons too. So let me move on and finish up here in the last 5 or 10 minutes. When we look at Trump's attacks on environmental regulations, environmental science, and his attacks on China, they take on greater strategic clarity when we view it as a struggle over hegemonic projects. That these aren't just because he's somehow a Neanderthal when it comes to environmental crisis. It's a struggle over which project is going to win out and become hegemonic. That's why there's all these fundamental attacks on environmental regulations, on the EPA, on this very science itself, and on China. Fits nicely into those attacks too. So what's the role of the left? I think if a green capitalist hegemonic bloc does consolidate, we should see it as a possible transition to eco-socialism. It's the best field of play for the left. And I actually like the old United Front policy of the Chinese Communist Party back in World War II, which used to go unite the many against the few, aim the main blow at the most reactionary, and defeat our enemies one by one. I think that's a pretty good strategic orientation actually to take today. So the long reformist struggle, 30, 40 years of a possible green capitalist bloc, means that we have a 30 or 40 year possibility of pushing that towards a left strategic transition towards an eco-socialist future. In terms of China itself, let me present some interesting things that are going on in Chinese thinking. So Li Perlin, who's vice president of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, writing in an article recently, said there's 3 major contradictions of Chinese society. Contradictions between the rich and the poor, labor and capital, and cadre and masses. Another guy, I'm not sure if the pronunciation is Zhu Wu. So this guy has the lead article in International Critical Thought, which is the Marxist journal of the Academy of Sciences. He writes, China has formed both socialist and capitalist production relations, both playing their roles respectively but simultaneously, and as the 2 kinds of production relations and economic laws coexist and interact, the more powerful one will guide the direction and determine the future and destiny of social development. If the capitalist economy surpasses the socialist public economy, the capitalist economic law will become the leading force and Chinese society may go backwards. So this is now being obviously debated in China. So I think the forces in China, the forces for a sort of ecological civilization are recognizing strategically that they also face capitalism in China. And I think the problem for the Chinese Communist Party is if they're willing to accept a politically conscious and a politically mobilized working class, which they're actually still scared of because of the Cultural Revolution and Tiananmen Square and other things that have gone down. But only a politically conscious and mobilized working class in China can really build an ecological civilization in alliance with a politically conscious and mobilized working class in the West. So these are obviously major and important strategic outlook that we're facing. I think the 2020 election is one of the first really major tests between these 2 blocs. Remember, the presidential debates of 2016 did not have one question on the environment, not one. And today, it's already a major focus of every Democratic candidate in the field. They all have to take a position on it. And lastly, and maybe during the questions, we may have time to discuss the Clean Energy Job Act in Illinois, which is perhaps the most advanced legislative effort around a Green New Deal in the country today, and it's happening right now in Illinois. How many of you are just interested, are familiar with the Clean Energy Jobs Act? That's good, about half the audience, that's good. So I've been going on for a while. Let me draw it to a close here. Thank you for your attention, and we could have a discussion.
Really nice talk. I just have a question. I'm going to direct this to the audience before I come back to Jerry. Has anybody here ever been to China? Raise of hands. Or okay, yeah. So we've got a few, right? That's interesting. I think, I mean, my experience was when I was there. I have to tell you, in all honesty, I went there looking to feel sympathy for what was going on or what they were trying to do, and being confronted with the reality of, like, when you go to major urban areas in that country, you will, it's not that you'll see, you'll be breathing air that's just unbelievably bad. I mean, most of these bigger cities, as Jerry alluded to, they still have just coal-fired plants circling all of the bigger towns for the most part. And they put so much pollutant into the air, your eyes burn. I mean, I've been told that, like, as far as like younger children go, China has one of the biggest problems with like asthma. It's been induced, I guess, by, you know, the fact that their air is so dirty. And but anyway, I just wanted to start there. But a couple of things that maybe you want to expand on. You know, what you were saying about the Chinese, this is right at the very end of where I'm starting here, maybe I will work back from there, but address this question about, with regards to the Chinese Communist Party and its fear of the masses, given the realities of what happened at Tiananmen. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Because I think that we need to discuss that in light of, like, really, I mean, this is, you know, a party has got a membership, I think, of around 75 or 100 million, roughly.
81 million.
81 million, okay, I was pretty close between that number. That's almost unimaginable. But relative to capitalism, I mean, it's true to say, now to come back the other way with this, like that One Belt, One Road project, to me, spells, and this is something that, again, in my paranoia maybe is the appropriate term, I'm not sure. I worry about, you know, the U.S. having no answer for this. You know, because we're just busy making F-35s, and the Chinese are taking it upon themselves to, like, reorder most of the third world, and maybe you want to expand on that a little bit also, because I think that this is something that Americans, and even in general, speaking about well-informed Americans, have little, if any, knowledge. But I know you've been there, you've seen some of this stuff, you've had the opportunity to talk to people that can address these things and what's actually going on. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Well, in terms of, you know, the mass involvement of the working class, civil society, so to speak, in the mainland, obviously China went through a lot in the Cultural Revolution. And actually there's been some reevaluation of, among some folks, saying that parts of the Cultural Revolution were good. Some parts not so good. And then, of course, the uprising around Tiananmen Square, which is, you can't even discuss in China today. So the party, I think the main approach of the party is to say, let us handle the politics. You know, work, make money, do better for your family. We know we have problems, but it's a 30 or 40-year transitional period to a full socialist society. And they fear that massive movements of the working class and rising Chinese middle class will disrupt all the economic gains that they have made, which have, of course, been spectacular. I don't think any country in the human history has advanced so quickly, so far. But the glass, what is it, half empty or half full, you know, in the analysis. So there's still quite a lot of problems. And I think as long as they maintain that sort of technological, bureaucratic view of we'll handle it all, that they're going to have problems. Because I think that the working class is still the motive force of social change in history. And rather than being scared of working class mobilization, I think they need to embrace it and make room for it. Not all under party leadership. I think you need independent trade unions. I think you need an independent environmental movement. I think, 73% of the strikes in China are against Chinese private corporations. And only 11% of the strikes in China are against state-owned enterprises, because those are actually the best jobs. Higher pay, more security. But when you have 73% of you, and there are thousands of strikes in China. I mean, people say there's no democracy in China or there's no civil society. There's more strikes in China than there are in the US. Nevertheless, those are almost all wildcat strikes. So you can say that the role of the All Chinese Federation of Unions is obviously not doing their job in representing the Chinese working class.
What's the state versus the private sector breakdown as far as the employment sector goes? I mean,
The vast majority of people are employed in the private sector today.
like 75, 85%?
I would have to go through my notes again, but probably somewhere around that. But some of the largest corporations are state-owned enterprises, and obviously all the banks and the financial sector and the key sectors. Real estate and the tech sector, those are probably the really biggest private sectors. In terms of their involvement in the third world, Chinese corporations, that's very, you invite me back, because that is a whole presentation in and of itself. Just remember that a lot of investments in the global south are from the state, a lot are from private corporations. Much of the investments are at very favorable rates. Some are not. Some Chinese private corporations act as any vulgar, exploitive Western corporations. Some do not. So it's a very complex and multifaceted picture. But obviously they've stepped in where a lot of Western capital has not gone. And I think they're offering a model of development that's very different from the West, right? Because all the countries that have experienced colonial exploitation need strong states for economic development. They're economically underdeveloped and they don't have capital. So China, by having a strong state and by offering a lot of capital, is oftentimes a very welcome partner in the global South. And I think that's one of the conflicts going on, is the different models of globalization between the West and the East.
I promise not to give a lecture under the guise of asking a question, but on a historical note, I want to thank you. I've gained some new perspectives from your talk. But on a historical note, global capitalism after World War II began its consolidation with the establishment of the Marshall Plan and with NATO. The principal goals of NATO was, of course, to push the Soviet Union back to its own borders. But the second, and most important in my opinion, was the consolidation of the police states so that if you had an uprising in one country, you wouldn't use the police or the army in that state. You draw upon the army or police from another state to put down the insurrections. And I think that was a very important step in the process of the globalization of the police state that you mentioned.
Well, I think one of the differences between what we're talking about now and the period of history that you talked about is sort of the question of bourgeois democracy. So we know that capitalism has always been imperialistic, colonial or imperialistic. It's always been violent, it's always been racist, it's always been sexist, it's always been repressive. But what's the difference between normative capitalism and fascism? So fascism eliminates the other side of normative capitalism, bourgeois democracy, which are mostly rights that the working class has fought for and won. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, freedom to assemble, freedom to protest, jury by your peers, and that fascism or neo-fascism also uses repression against other sections of their own class, the bourgeoisie. And so I think that's what, when I read sort of that quote from McRaven, Admiral McRaven, I think it goes to that point. The difference between normative repressive capitalism and what authoritarian police state capitalism implies, particularly within Europe and the United States. I mean, we had the McCarthy period, which is, I think, the closest we've come to fascism in America, certainly. But we've never been a Chile under Pinochet, or certainly not Italy under Mussolini or something like that. So I think that's sort of the difference in the era today.
I wanted to thank you for your talk, Jerry. It was very erudite, and I learned a lot and enjoyed it. You didn't concentrate, which is just fine, on the Green New Deal, but I wanted to voice my objections to it. The Green New Deal has a lot of problems, and I'm going to start historically. I first heard the term Green New Deal when it was put forth by the Green Party. And the idea of the Green New Deal was going to be an economic transformation that would reduce, among other things, consumption in America. And the people who are green and somewhat on the left, who I read who are critical of the Green New Deal, say what's needed is not a new production of infrastructure and a new production of vehicles and sustainable technology, etc. What's needed is a 75% cut in American consumption now. And and that's the sort of cut in consumption that's needed in order to reduce the enormous and ridiculous carbon footprint of Americans and via their consumption. And similar cuts need to be taken in the rest of what we call the first and maybe even the second world. But as if that isn't bad enough, the idea, well, first of all, the specifics of the Green New Deal are very murky, because what's being put forth is, correct me if I'm wrong, nothing more specific than forming a committee to talk about it at this point legislatively. But the talk that they have is that the government will sell bonds to fund the infrastructure and to fund the new sustainable industries and industries in sustainable technology, etc. And this is all wrong also, because this not only rewards the financial class in America and indebts the future of America. But what's needed is an enormous tax on the wealthy in order to fund this, and a tax on, and a significant tax on financial transactions in order to fund this. That this would be the fair way forward, the way that I think would do the most to solve not just some of our economic problems, but some of our social problems too. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. I had one more thing to say. I really can't. Oh, yes. I have a different fear than Roberts about the One Belt, One Road plan. I actually could tolerate seeing America get economically and financially left in the dust. And even though, of course, as with almost not only every crisis and every cataclysm, but with almost everything that happens in this world, the wrong people will pay. Aside from that, I have a different fear, that is that China is talking about ramping up and building the infrastructure in order to have great industry in the third world. And as you sort of slightly pointed out, we're already at a crisis of overproduction at this point. And of course, we've got to revisit our marks a little bit and come to realize that there's such a thing as an overproduction in services also. But a new, strong industrial production, I find myself asking, are these people also going to be the consumers? Are Africans and South Asians going to be the new consumer class to consume all this overproduction? It doesn't sound, it sounds like a great idea, and a bunch of people, a very bunch of deserving people might benefit from it, but in the end, it sounds like a very bad plan. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. Thanks.
Okay, so two questions. First, there is no one Green New Deal. It's a concept that's going to be fought about, and with different forces putting forward different visions and different ideas for the next rather long period, I believe, 10, 20, 30 years. I mean, this is going to be a continual battle. So the left has a role to play within that discussion, within that debate, about what is our vision of a Green New Deal, which is, of course, more radical than what the vision of being put forward by Senator Markley and AOC at this point. But I think their intervention is extremely significant because it's made the Green New Deal for the first time a national discussion and has tied together social justice with environmental justice. I know the Green Party's been talking about it for a long time, with an audience of that maybe could fit into the space of a phone booth, given the size of the American population. Green New Deal was never a mass discussion when it was limited to the Green Party and the environmental movement, with the left environmental movement with the United States. We have to break out of that. It has to become a discussion of 300 million people, and that's what it's becoming. So we owe a lot of gratitude to AOC and Senator Markley for that. I think we're also talking about, to me, a 30 to 40 year transitional period of struggle. So I think there's going to be a lot of reformist policies that we need to take a position on. And I don't think that we should condemn or say every reformist policy is not good enough. I mean, that's what the left, a good part of the left in the United States, that's like what we've been, our rhetoric for my entire lifetime and the lifetime of my grandparents and my parents. Oh, it's bullshit. It's not enough. And that leaves us on the sidelines. Historically, you got to get in there and fight. You got to fight for the immediate changes as well as presenting a more strategic vision and using the reformist changes to advance the agenda closer to the vision and attainment of eco-socialism. You're not going to do that by standing on the sidelines and just saying, eco-socialism, everything that you're doing, Ocasio-Cortez is bullshit, it's not enough, you're a false social democrat, you all got to listen to me, I'm the real solution here. That's, that's typical left sectarianism in this country. It's led to a dead end. So there's a lot of tactics and strategy involved here, and there's going to be ongoing debate and discussion, just like we're having here today, that's going to go on for a long time. But certainly I think the left has a key role to play in advancing a more fuller eco-socialist vision within the Green New Deal, absolutely. The One Belt, One Road, yeah, it could be an ecological disaster. That's the contradiction. And you're right, I mean, what are you building infrastructure for if not from Asia to the heart of Europe, if not to sell more commodities and have more sweatshop production of commodities. So on the other hand, industrialization is not the industrialization that I grew up with and worked in. I'm still working at U.S. Southworks, and I laid off in '82 or something, and that industrial era is gone. Industrialization today is the fourth industrial revolution. It's a high-tech industry. So don't expect the 1950s industry to go to Africa. Expect the 2020 industry, productive activity to be built. So there's a struggle over that. There's a debate within the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the BRIC Bank and all this stuff. They have all these platforms and commitments to green development, green infrastructure. Well, yeah and no. I mean, it could be a disaster or it could be some commitment. So that's part of the struggle between green capitalism and the green left, how that development takes place. And as I pointed out, the Chinese have already committed to building 240 new coal mines within OBRA already, within the One Belt, One Road already. And by building those coal mines today, that is a 10, 20-year commitment. You don't build a coal mine and shut it down in 3 or 4 years. You trap a country into that form of energy production with all the capital investment in it. You just don't walk away from that. So these are fundamental problems and contradictions that China faces and that we all face, and why the left has to play a strong role. I think we both certainly agree on that. And then it comes down to a matter of strategy and tactics and what reforms that you pursue, at what pace, and what type of criticisms that you make and when you make them.
Can you address this point about the financial class?
To the microphone. Go to the microphone.
I was just, your comment.
I'll get back to it.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very nice to have get a total picture. I'm glad you mentioned the change in industrialization, and I would like to ask you the question. You said that change, the agents of change would be the workers, but in the age of automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, and so on, the whole idea of work has changed. So I have a problem with that. My second point is there is a struggle going on for control of the means of surveillance today, whether it is the state, local authorities, or corporations and so on. How does this fit into the picture of change you are presenting to us? Thank you.
Okay. Again, two questions, I guess. The first was on the working class as a motivated force of history. I don't mean simply at the point of production. To me, the social movements, as well as the point of production, are key to social change, right? So whether it's the women's movement, civil rights movement, environmental movement, I think, or the struggle of unions or unorganized workers, precariat workers, all that to me is part of the working class changing social conditions and changing history. So if we stick to a rather dogmatic definition of the working class, it's a dead end. I agree with you. In terms of, what was the second?
Surveillance.
Surveillance. Oh, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I think surveillance is a key part of Bill Robinson's analysis in terms of repressive authoritarian capitalism. And I think it's also a key danger in China that is deep and long on the road of AI surveillance capitalism. And by the way, one of their main surveillance corporations among the top 10 investors is JP Morgan and UBS. So again, these are all transnational investors rather than Chinese and U.S. I know we're talking about China and U.S. a lot, but I'd like to come back, and this goes to finance, the fact that finance is transnational and co-invested globally. But it's hard to break out of sort of this nation-centric concept of the world. I think it's very interesting that, finally people, because of all the security breaches that we've experienced, that a lot of people, as well as the politicians, have sort of woken up all of a sudden to the question of privacy and trying to control, possibly break up, like Elizabeth Warren has talked about, breaking up the main tech companies. I think in Europe they have more stricter privacy laws. So I think that struggle is really important, because I think that struggle is part of the way you block authoritarian capitalism from fully developing. I mean, the development of surveillance capitalism and their ability is really frightening, I think, when you merge that with authoritarianism. The only thing that may be holding it back is too much data. That, they have so much, can they make sense of it or get out of it what they need? Snowden showed us what they're looking at. I mean, that's part of the incredible hypocrisy around the attacking Huawei. The Chinese corporation that's developing 5G is the largest telecommunications corporation in the world right now. The U.S. complaining about using Huawei possibly to spy or to surveil security. My God, have we forgotten what Snowden talked about just a few years ago? And the U.S. is looking at everybody in every country in the world. What hypocrisy there of the news media not covering the other half of that story. And it's just amazing. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for your talk. You may have addressed this earlier because we were a little late, but I'm just wondering about one of the major drivers of consumption is population growth. And if that's, and certainly the Chinese have addressed that more thoroughly and more rigorously or whatever than anybody else in the world, but how do you see that fitting into the construct that you're building here?
Yeah. Well, obviously, there's, which is part of the argument, there's a limit to the carrying capacity of the planet Earth. We're in a finite environment, we're on a finite planet, how much can it carry? So to what extent have we reached it? Well, under capitalism, it seems that we've gone, if you look at it from a population control question, from capitalism's point of view, they already have a surplus population that's starving and is unemployed and is in the billions of people. Goes to your point about less consumption. But if we move into an eco-socialist type of society where consumption is ecologically mediated, then we could probably support the current population, even probably a larger population. So the limit of population, I think, is dependent on the type of social economic system that we're building and that we have. I think that's where the real basic problem is in the distribution question of distribution of resources, not so much in the question of population. We don't really know what the carrying capacity of the human population really is. But some, I think, Marxists used to argue that there is no limit. That I would disagree with, because they were debating Malthusian on the question of population control. Obviously, in a finite environment, there's finite limits, but I don't think we know what those are, nor have we reached them if we had a fair distribution of resources.
Is that it? Nobody else? Okay, well, thank you, Jerry.
Can I just say one thing? I have my book here, special price of just $10, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Democracy. One of the major chapters is on the question of the environment, as well as transnational production, finance, covers, and many other things. So if you're interested, please just come by and pick one up. Thank you.
Again.